I had counted 412 blankets that week, and I remember that number better than I remember most of what came after, because counting blankets was the kind of thing I understood. Bodies needing warmth. Warmth we could give. Nothing complicated about it. The Ember Reach Sanctuary sat at the top of the last road out of the lowlands, a temple older than anyone could put a date to, its infirmary wing added on so many generations back that the newer stone had gone the same weathered gray as the old. War had pushed the valley people up the mountain in waves for 3 months straight, and I was the ward nurse, which meant I did not turn anyone away, and I did not ask what they'd left burning behind them. I cleaned wounds. I counted blankets. I made sure the children ate before I did. The priests kept to the upper halls, reading the carvings on the sanctuary walls like men reading old debts nobody living remembered signing. I paid them little mind. They paid me less. She came in on a night when the wind off the passes was screaming through the shutters, carried by a farmer named Oskin, who'd found her tangled in briar at the tree line, wings torn, one eye swollen shut, crying in a high broken register that didn't sound like any animal I knew, a dragon child, small enough to fit across both my forearms, scales the deep red of a coal just starting to catch, and so frightened she'd bitten a strip out of Oskin's sleeve before he ever got her through the door. Put her down and back out, I told him, and he did, gladly. I'd never tended a dragon before. I tended her anyway, the way I'd have tended anything that came through that door hurt and screaming, cleaned the wing wound with the same salve I used on burned children, held her jaw gentle but firm to check the eye, hummed the same flat, tuneless thing I hummed over every frightened kid in that ward, because tune wasn't the point. Steadiness was the point. She quieted somewhere around the third verse of Nothing in Particular, worn down to shivering, and let me wrap her in the smallest blanket I had. I named her Alira because she needed a name, and none of the refugees could tell me hers, and because it was my grandmother's middle name, and grandmothers ought to be good for something. The trouble started the next morning, when the ward woke up and saw what I'd kept. Word moves fast in a room full of frightened people. By midday, half the refugees were saying the dragons had brought the fires that drove them from their homes, and here was one bedded down not 30 feet from their children. A woman named Priska Dell, who'd walked 11 days with a baby on her hip, told me flat out that if the beast stayed, she'd take her family back down into the burning, rather than sleep under the same roof. She's a child, I said, same as yours. She's not the same as anything, Priska said, and she wasn't wrong to be afraid, and I didn't have a clever answer for her, so I just kept doing what I was doing, because Alira's fever hadn't broken yet, and fear doesn't feed a fever any better than it feeds a person. Brother Aldous came down from the upper halls on the second day, robes dusty from wherever he'd been kneeling, and stood over the cot a long while without saying anything useful. You ought to send her back to the mountain, he said finally. Whatever finds her will not be pleased to find her here. Then whatever finds her can be displeased at me instead. He looked at me then, in a way that had nothing to do with the dragon at all. A long, searching look, like he was trying to read something off my face, the way he read the carvings upstairs. Ashdown, he said. That's an old name in these halls, girl. Older than you'd guess. I told him I didn't have time for old names. I had a fever to watch, and he left it there, though he didn't look satisfied leaving it. I kept her fed on broth and river fish for 6 days. I kept the frightened ones back with nothing but my own body between them and her cot, which wasn't much of a wall, but it held. On the 4th night she stopped flinching when my hand came near her jaw. On the 5th, she pressed her small burned wing against my palm like she was checking I was still there. I won't pretend that didn't do something to me. I'd buried a husband and raised no children of my own, and there is a particular ache in being needed by something that has no one else, and I'd forgotten how much I'd missed it until she leaned into my hand and made a sound low in her throat that wasn't crying anymore. On the 7th morning, the mountain woke up. It didn't sound like thunder. It sounded like the whole sanctuary taking a breath it had been holding for 100 years, a deep groan through the stone, dust sifting from the old carved ceiling, and then the great doors at the far end of the hall shuttered open on their own weight, and something came through them that made every refugee in that ward go silent at once. She was ancient in the way mountains are ancient. Scales the color of banked iron, ridged and cracked with age along her spine, wings folded like closed cathedral doors, and eyes that swept the room once, slow, taking in the huddled families, the overturned cots, the panic already starting to rise, and I understood, the way you understand weather coming, that she had not come for gentle reasons. People scattered. I didn't. I got between her and the cot where Alira lay too weak to run, and I stood there with my empty hands and my heart going like a hammer, and I said the only thing I had, which was, she's healing. Look at her, she's healing. The great dragon's head lowered until one iron-colored eye, huge as a wagon wheel, was level with mine, close enough that I felt the heat off her breath. She did not look at Alira. She looked at me, at my hands, chapped and stained with salve, at the blanket I still had wrapped around my shoulders against the cold, at whatever it is a creature like that sees in a person that a mirror never shows us about ourselves. You bound her wing with river willow, she said, in a voice that moved the floor more than the air. That is an old binding. My kin taught it to a woman of this mountain once, in a war before your grandfather's grandfathers were born, when her people sheltered mine from fire, with no promise of return. Her eye didn't move from my face. Ashdown, she said, the way Brother Aldous had said it, like a key turning. The blood remembers what the mind forgets. I didn't understand it then, and I'm not sure I fully understand it now. Some old pact between a frightened woman and a frightened dragon, centuries back, that nobody alive had kept on purpose, that had simply worn its way down through blankets and broth and river willow salve into my own two hands without my ever choosing it. The ancient one, Veonora, she told me her name was, later, when the ward had calmed and the fear had gone out of the room, didn't ask anything of me. She didn't demand a bow or a debt repaid in gold or blood. She only lowered her great head lower still, until it rested a moment against the stone floor beside Alira's cot, and let the hatchling press her small burned wing against that enormous jaw, the same way she'd pressed it against my palm. You were not chosen for this, Veonora said to me, quiet now, quiet enough that only I heard it over the room's held breath. You simply did what was needed, the way your blood always has, whether anyone was watching or not. That is worth more to us than any oath sworn on purpose. She left before nightfall, and Alira stayed, growing slow and strong through that hard winter, in a corner of the infirmary the refugees no longer feared, because they'd seen what I'd seen. That being watched over by something old and powerful isn't a thing to dread, if what you did to earn it was simply kindness, offered without expecting to be seen at all. I still count blankets. I still clean wounds and hum flat, tuneless songs over frightened children, human and otherwise. Nobody up in the priests' halls reads the old carvings about me, and I wouldn't want them to. But some nights, when the wind comes screaming off the passes the way it did that first night, I feel the mountains settle a little easier under the sanctuary floor, as if something very old is still listening, and still glad, for reasons it never asked me to understand.